The idea begins on Earth and the dividing line of two major civilizations, India and China. It has profoundly changed both, as well as every other country in the Far East. The idea is Buddhism. Its greatest influence in terms of area, population, and duration has been in China, where it went through a splendid transformation. It was about 500 years before Christ. A young Indian prince, Gautama Sakyamuni, was deeply disturbed by the bondage of human existence. Birth, age, illness, and death. Despite the glory and pleasures of royalty, he answered an inner call to sever worldly attachments and undergo extreme trials until he became Buddha, the enlightened one. Buddha saw life as a stream of countless individuals going through endless rebirth, every life the result of former lives, and every fate the effect of former good or evil deeds. Within the cycle of rebirth, suffering is inevitable. To attain liberation is to break away from this cycle and enter into nirvana, an inscrutable state of absolute transcendence. How can one reach this state? Buddha's answer in its simplest form was moral conduct, deep contemplation, and intuitive wisdom. Buddha's teaching has been compared to rafts crossing the sea of suffering to reach the shores of nirvana. There are two main schools in Buddhism. The one stressing personal liberation is called Theravada, or more popularly Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. And the one stressing universal liberation is called Mahayana, the greater vehicle. During the 3rd century BC, with the expanding power of the Indian king Ashoka, Buddhism burst out of the Ganges Valley and spread in all directions. In the northwest, it took root in Gandhara and Kashmir. From there, by the beginning of the Christian era, it was moving through Central Asian international highways to China. The Chinese dynasty then was Han, a power in the east that matched Rome in the west. Han influence dominated East Asia from Korea to Chinese Turkestan, from the Gobi Desert to Vietnam. The national creed was Confucianism, a benevolent ruler under the mandate of heaven whose will coincides with that of the people. An orderly society with a rigid family structure, a moral code based on humanity and the practice of perfect virtue for its own sake. The cosmic view was Taoism. Tao, or the way of nature, governs all life, manifesting itself in yin and yang, the negative and positive forces that shape all things. A philosophy of passivity, with avoidance of worldly strife and of a return to purity for the attainment of eternal life. Into this self-contained and smug world came trickles of a foreign idea. The White Horse Temple, reputedly the first Chinese Buddhist monastery, was founded on the legend that Buddha appeared as a golden deity in the dream of Emperor Ming. The earliest historical mention of a Chinese Buddhist community occurred in 65 AD. By the middle of the 2nd century, Buddha was worshipped in the palace along with Taoist deities. But not until the period after the collapse of the Han Empire did Buddhism gain real momentum in China. In the north, under the invading Turkic and Tibetan tribes, incessant warfare, chaos, and misery provided a climate ripe for a religion affording physical and spiritual refuge to the masses. By entering monkhood, common people escaped military and labor services as well as taxation. Non-Chinese rulers, unshackled by Confucian and Taoist traditions, embraced this non-Chinese faith to ensure their victory and prosperity. They listened to advice from monks who exercised a restraining influence over wanton killing through the preaching of compassion, thus endearing themselves to the downtrodden Chinese. In the south, where the Chinese court found haven, uncertainty and frustration favored the growth of metaphysical speculation. Neo-Taoists considered inactivity as virtue and non-being as the origin of all things. The sage must identify himself with non-being, which is oblivious of self and others, life and death, right and wrong. This seemed to mirror the basic Buddhist ideal of emptiness. Thus, a sympathetic dialogue developed between the learned monks and the literati, whose influence enabled Buddhism to gain converts among royalty and the rich. In the chaos of 4th century China, the philosophical foundation of Chinese Buddhism was laid by a few eminent monks such as Dao An, who merged two main currents of Buddhist thought, the practice of meditation and the doctrine of emptiness. His disciple, Hui Yuan, likened the indestructibility of the spirit to the endless transmission of fire from wood to wood, and argued at court that monks be exempt from bowing to the emperor. Another eminent monk, Dao Sheng, propagated the fundamental Mahayana tenet that all sentient beings possess the Buddha nature and are capable of becoming Buddha. He pioneered in the belief of sudden and complete enlightenment after a long process of religious training. And Buddhism began to change the Chinese landscape. The strategic point for transmitting Buddhism into China was Dunhuang, where the northern and southern overland routes met. As early as the middle of the 4th century, cave temples were carved out of the hills to serve traveling monks and native believers. Eventually, this became a center of devotion for the next 1,000 years, and a depository of Buddhist art to this day. Through Dunhuang, two great events occurred at the turn of the century. In 399, Fa Xian, the first Chinese monk to complete his pilgrimage to India, started his journey. In 401, from Kucha, the high monk Kumarajiva traveled to the capital Chang'an to begin his monumental project of rendering into Chinese some of the most important Mahayana scriptures. The Chinese traveler survived untold hardships to reach sacred sites along the Ganges and study holy teachings at the source. Later, he sailed to Ceylon for a short stay. Then, after 200 days at sea, he returned home in 414. By that time, the north had been unified by a Turkic tribe whose emperors identified themselves with Buddhas. The founder of this northern Wei dynasty encouraged the erection of images and temples and invited a monk to be imperial advisor. However, a Chinese Taoist and a Confucian minister convinced the third northern Wei emperor that Buddhism was a fictitious foreign religion. Thus, the first of three great persecutions of Buddhism in Chinese history began. In 446, a drastic edict was issued to destroy all stupas, paintings, and sutras, and to execute all monks. Restoration came swiftly after the ruler died 8 years later. The succeeding emperor considered himself the reincarnation of Buddha and appointed Tan Yao the chief of monks in 460. As a symbol of the permanence of Buddhism, he created the cave temples of Yunkang. In the first group of caves appeared 5 gigantic Buddha figures representing the past emperors. group housed numerous images of Buddha, musicians, and donors, and bodhisattvas who refrained from entering nirvana in order to save other sentient beings. Admiration for Chinese culture motivated the 6th Northern Wei Emperor to move his capital to Luoyang. Temple construction in the new capital mushroomed until 1/3 of the dwelling area in the city was occupied by monks. To rival the glory of Yunkang, cave temples were created at nearby Lungmen. In a cave sponsored by the imperial family, we can still see the magnificence of the processions of emperors and empresses paying respect to the Buddha. Meanwhile, the south produced its Buddhist monarch, Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, whose hair was shaved to symbolize devotion. He constructed numerous temples, gave up wine and meat, and prohibited the use of living things in medicine and sacrifice. He convened assemblies to elucidate sutras, with audiences as great as 50,000, including envoys from Persia, Khotan, and Korea. Back in the north, another Emperor Wu, but of the northern Zhou dynasty, had a different vision. Aiming to restore the glory of ancient China, he favored Confucianism and charged Buddhism with fostering disloyalty toward the country and breaking down filial piety at home. The waste of wealth in temple construction and the harboring of undesirable elements in the monastic community were added reasons for the second great persecution of 574. Before Emperor Wu died 4 years later, tens of thousands of temples were appropriated by the imperial family and the aristocracy, and probably more than 1 million monks and nuns were defrocked. The storm was brief. The founding by Emperor Wan of the new Sui dynasty in 581 ushered in the golden era of Chinese Buddhism. Calling himself Emperor, disciple of the Buddha, he used this religion as a binding influence in the reunification of North and South. His fame attracted envoys from Japan and Korea to seek Buddhist teachings. The year 600 marked the beginning of China's role as the light of East Asia. The dynastic change from Sui to Tang in 618 did not affect the progress of Buddhism. The second Tang emperor, Taizong, professed to be a Taoist and based his governmental structure on Confucian principles, but he relied on Buddhism for gaining popular support and for the spiritual welfare of the empire. Tang's influence extended far beyond its boundaries, and many pilgrims reached India to seek original scriptures. Among them, the most famous was Xuanzang, who began his journey in 629. Surviving many perils in deserts and mountains, he finally reached the Indus Valley, sailed down the Ganges, and saw the Bodhi tree under which Buddha attained enlightenment. His fame spread throughout India as he traveled and studied. He was honored by the king. After a pilgrimage of 16 years, he received a tumultuous welcome upon returning to the capital, Chang'an. With Emperor Taizong's support, he devoted the rest of his life to translating the voluminous texts he had brought back. Xuanzang founded the school which explains all phenomena in terms of one ultimate reality: mind. The emperor was so impressed by his work that he compared looking at the scriptures to gazing at the sky or sea, immeasurable in height and unfathomable in depth. The height of imperial patronage was reached under the influence of Emperor Taizong's daughter-in-law, who became the most ambitious and powerful empress in Chinese history. In 672, she ordered the carving of the great Vairochana Buddha, or the Brilliant One, at Lungmen. When she finally founded a new dynasty, she claimed herself the future Buddha. In mid-7th century, the Arabs and the Tibetans interrupted the Central Asian land route. Chinese pilgrims had to travel by sea to reach India. The first important monk to do this was I Ching, whose voyages resulted in bringing back new scriptures and a report of the Buddhist kingdoms in the southern archipelago, including Java, where he did a great deal of translation. But the heart of Chinese Buddhism is its distinctive and profound religious thinking. The transformation from Indian to Chinese Buddhism began in mid-6th century and was completed in the 7th and 8th centuries. Among native schools, 4 form the spirit and substance of Chinese Buddhism: the Tian Tai and Huayan schools for doctrine, the Chan and Pure Land schools for practice. All 4 belong to Mahayana, or the greater vehicle, which believes that universal liberation for all sentient beings is the aim of the Buddha. The Tian Tai master, Zhe synthesized all forms of Buddhism, arriving at the conclusion of a threefold truth: emptiness, phenomena, and the middle way. All things have no reality and are therefore empty. They enjoy temporary existence as phenomena reached by the senses. Every existence is empty and temporary at the same time, with the truth of the middle way. Therefore, the whole cosmos, with its realms interwoven and interpenetrated, may be present in a grain of sand or the point of a hair. Cryptically, one thought is 3,000 worlds, which might be interpreted as, in every instance of thought, all possible worlds are involved. This one in all and all in one doctrine leads to the idea that Buddha nature is to be found in everything, from the biggest to the tiniest. Therefore, all beings can be converted to enter the path of the Buddha, as proclaimed in the Lotus Sutra. Lotus, the symbol of purity, rises from the mud but is unsullied. The Huayan school concentrated on the Garland Sutra. Its founder was Fazang. His most famous sermon used as an analogy a golden lion in the palace. Gold is the symbol of principle, and the lion is the symbol of phenomenon. The principle has no form, but may assume any form. The eyes, ears, and hairs are all gold, as is the whole lion. So the whole lion is in the eye, the ear, or even a strand of hair. This is the doctrine of interpenetration and mutual identification of all phenomena. It was recorded that Fazang used mirrors to illustrate this concept. As the Buddha figure in each mirror is reflected in every other mirror, so each individual phenomenon embraces every other phenomenon. Thus, the Huayan school proclaimed that the entire universe arises simultaneously through reciprocal causation. The one is the many is one. It spread the belief that all things are manifestations of the same supreme mind. Religious philosophy is probably never as readily acceptable by the masses as religious imagination. The enchanting picture of a pure and happy land presided over by Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light, who responds to anyone meditating or calling upon his name in good faith, is irresistible to people who toil and worry. Thus, the Pure Land school became the most popular in China. The Pure Land Sutra describes how Amitabha vowed that anyone with absolute faith in him shall be reborn in his western paradise. His chief minister, Wan Yin, who in later centuries evolved into the female goddess of mercy, looks in all directions to save people from suffering and danger. As the Bodhisattva of infinite passion, he can assume various forms to carry out his mission. He is sometimes depicted with 8 or 11 heads, or with 1,000 eyes and arms, the better to see all and to help all. The main proponents of this school were Dao Zhou and his disciple Shan Dao. They promoted the practice of Nianfo, or uttering the name of Amitabha with an undivided mind to assure rebirth in the Western paradise, as well as the practice of chanting sutras, worshipping images, meditating on and singing praises to the Buddha. On the other hand, they painted a picture of hell with horrors of torture and violence. These images of heaven and hell have been imprinted on every Chinese mind ever since. The most important Chinese development in Buddhism is the Chan or Zen school. Chan is intuitive meditation with strict discipline, through which one's Buddha nature can be revealed. Legend has it that Bodhidharma, the first patriarch of Chan, crossed the Yangtze River on a reed branch to the north, where he sat in front of a wall for 9 years. The story illustrates the emphasis of Chan on inner enlightenment, without words, images, temples, or sutras. The argument among believers over gradual enlightenment versus sudden enlightenment split Chan into 2 sub-schools, the northern and the southern. The 6th patriarch, Weng and his disciples, championed the idea that intuitive wisdom and enlightenment come suddenly. This southern school eventually prevailed over the northern. Chan masters differ in teaching. Some use enigmatic utterings, gestures, or acts ranging to the extreme of scolding and beating. Some use the case method of question and answer. Some practice meditation in silence. But all consider words a poor medium and logic self-defeating. After all, everyone has within himself the Buddha nature. One only has to awaken it, to attain a sudden flash of insight for the unity of all existence in a great tranquility, the true emptiness. While intellectual followers of Chan lived in simplicity, the popular Buddhist church catered to imperial favor and attracted the multitude by staging celebrations and memorial services, and by offering vegetable feasts, storytelling lectures, and colorful festivals. Such activities exerted a tremendous influence on Chinese folk art and literature. By the 9th century, the wealth and power of the church had nurtured corruption within and incurred hatred and jealousy without. The form prospered, the substance decayed. The government, weakened by rebellions and misrule since 755, looked hungrily at the loss of revenue resulting from the tax-exempt status of the church. This brought about the 3rd great persecution of 845, which spared only a few temples. In all, 4,600 monasteries, 40,000 temples and shrines were demolished. 260,000 monks and nuns were defrocked, and 150,000 slaves taken over. Hundreds of millions of acres of temple land were confiscated, and an untold number of gold, silver, bronze, and iron images melted. Although the next year the emperor died and revival began with the new ruler, this persecution nevertheless marked the end of the golden period of Chinese Buddhism. Tang ended in 906. In the next half-century, 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms once more engaged in chaotic struggles. Declining Buddhism served only to shore up the dreams of the temporary rulers and to give solace to insecure people. The brutality of life sharpened their yearning for rebirth in the Pure Land. The popularity of Guanyin amounted to a universal begging for mercy. The desire for multiple copies of sutras, spells, and images must have spurred the invention of block printing sometime during the 7th to 8th century. The oldest extant printed book, dated 868, was of excerpts from the Diamond Sutra, distributed freely by the donor as a memorial to his parents. A landmark in the history of printing was the 10th century edition of the Chinese Tripitaka, or complete Buddhist canon, printed from 130,000 engraved blocks. It was ordered by the founder of the Sung dynasty, who reunified China in an uneasy peace with northern non-Chinese powers. This set is a later edition that retains the same scope and form. Outwardly, Buddhism during the Sung dynasty continued to grace the Chinese landscape, with the Pure Land school very much a part of daily life. The tranquility and simplicity in painting and poetry showed more than a trace of charm. Later Sung paintings of this tendency left a deep imprint on Japanese art. Meanwhile, the Hinayana ideal of arhats, or passionless ones who have attained personal liberation, became popular from the 10th century on. Called Lohan in Chinese, they proliferated from 16 to 18 to 500 and acquired attributes of Taoist immortals, such as the magic power to subdue dragons and tigers. When the Mongols rose in the 13th century to conquer all of China, they embraced Tibetan Lamaism, which took over the court of Kublai Khan. Lamaism is derived from Tantric Buddhism. Its practice consists of prayers, recitations, special techniques, and various forms of meditation, including even a yoga practice of sexual union, which is none other than the union of compassion and wisdom, as symbolized by the Yab-Yum, or father-mother image. However, the highest teaching of Lamaism is bound in a doctrine called Mahamudra, the great symbol, which is very similar to the principle of Chan Buddhism. With the return to Chinese rule in the Ming dynasty, an eminent Lama, Tsongkhapa, established a new school in Tibet, commonly known as the Yellow Sect, so called because of the saffron attire of its monks. From Tibet, the sect finally spread to the Ordos and Manchuria. Based upon the adage that different paths lead to the same goal, the Chinese tendency to synthesize and harmonize has succeeded in merging Buddhism with Confucianism and Taoism. In the process, Buddhism has relaxed the rigidity of Confucian ethics and checked the abandon of the Taoist surrender to nature. It has extended the Chinese compassion for humanity to all living things. It has expanded the Chinese mind by introducing the view of the universe as a time-space continuum without beginning or end, by interpreting creation as reciprocal causes and effects, by presenting all phenomena as a projection of the mind, and by identifying eternity, infinity, and perfect wisdom with emptiness, a state beyond words and imagination. The all-inclusiveness of its doctrine eliminates the duality of self and others, real and unreal, being and non-being. As mountains, deserts, and oceans cease to act as barriers in the transmission of ideas, the whole span of human drama, from the travels of Central Asian monks on ancient silk routes to the maturity of Chinese Buddhism, has become perhaps merely a chapter in the development of world Buddhism, which, enriched by all other faiths, will meet the challenge of present-day needs and contribute to true peace in the mind of man.